My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 31 years old, and the last thing my mother ever called me in public was an expensive mistake. She said it at my younger brother's engagement party while holding a crystal champagne glass like it weighed less than her opinion of me. There she is, she laughed loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. The daughter who cost us everything and gave us nothing. People chuckled awkwardly. Someone looked away. Someone else pretended not to hear. I stood there with an unopened gift in one hand and a faded blue music box in the other, the only thing I'd kept from my childhood. I almost turned around and walked out. I probably should have. But what happened before that night, and what happened because I stayed, changed every part of my life in a way none of us could have imagined. Welcome back. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, I hope this story reminds you that your worth isn't decided by the people who refuse to see it. If you enjoy heartfelt family stories with meaningful endings, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let me tell you what happened. For as long as I could remember, my family believed that achievement was another word for love. My father was one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in Seattle. My mother managed every detail of his public life with military precision. Charity galas, hospital fundraisers, medical boards, she knew everyone worth knowing. Then there was my younger brother, Ethan. He was brilliant. At least that's what everyone said. Every report card was framed. Every soccer trophy had its own shelf. Every accomplishment became another family celebration. I was never ignored completely. I was simply edited out. When relatives visited, they'd ask about Ethan's grades. When neighbors stopped by, my parents proudly showed them his awards. If anyone asked what I liked, my mother always answered before I could. Oh, Naomi just likes little hobbies. Those little hobbies were painting, restoring antique furniture, and designing spaces that made people feel at home. No one considered them real talents. The blue music box sitting on my bedroom shelf was the only thing that ever felt like mine. It had belonged to my grandmother. She used to wind it every birthday and tell me, "Some people bloom late, sweetheart. That doesn't mean they're planted wrong." After she passed away, everyone forgot those words. I never did. The older I became, the more obvious the difference was. When Ethan earned an A, we went out for steak. When I earned an A, my father smiled without looking up from his phone and said, "Good, keep trying." When Ethan talked about becoming a doctor, my parents practically planned the celebration before he'd even finished high school. When I said I wanted to study interior architecture, the room went quiet. My mother finally sighed. "That's decorating, Naomi. People hire decorators after they've made real money." I laughed because everyone else did. Later that night, I cried into my pillow so quietly that even I barely heard myself. I learned early that disappointment could become a habit. Still, I kept creating. I repainted old furniture from garage sales. I rearranged my room every few months. Teachers praised my eye for design, but compliments from strangers never seemed to matter at home. Then came the moment I still remember more clearly than almost anything else. It was my high school graduation. Every graduate walked across the stage while families filled the auditorium with applause. When my name was announced, I looked toward my parents. Their seats were empty. At first, I thought they had stepped outside. After the ceremony, I found them in the parking lot surrounding Ethan. He'd won a regional science competition that afternoon, and they'd left halfway through my graduation to surprise him. My diploma was still in my hand when my mother hugged him. She looked at me and smiled as if nothing unusual had happened. "You understand," she said. "This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." I wanted to ask whether my graduation had been one too. Instead, I nodded. That night, I wound my grandmother's blue music box for the first time in years. The tiny melody echoed through my bedroom. It sounded lonelier than I remembered. A few months later, I was accepted into one of the best design programs in the state. I ran into the kitchen with the acceptance letter shaking in my hands. My father read it for less than 10 seconds. "Congratulations," he said. "Unfortunately, we can't afford 2 college educations." I stared at him. Ethan's medical school savings come first. But my scholarship covers most of it. Most isn't all. My mother folded the letter and handed it back. "You'll figure something out. You're independent." Independent. It sounded flattering. It wasn't. It meant I had been quietly removed from the list of people worth investing in. That evening I packed 2 suitcases, tucked my grandmother's blue music box between my sweaters, and left before sunrise. No dramatic goodbye. No shouting. No slam doors. Just a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. I hope one day you love me for who I am instead of who you wanted me to become. No one called. No one came after me. For a long time, I thought that silence was the answer. I was wrong. The years ahead would teach me that sometimes silence isn't the end of a story. Sometimes it's simply the space where a new life begins. The first apartment I rented was barely bigger than a hotel room. The radiator rattled all night. The kitchen sink leaked. When it rained, I placed a bowl near the window because the ceiling liked to remind me it had seen better days. It wasn't much, but every inch of that tiny apartment belonged to me. For the first time in my life, no one told me what my dreams were worth. During the day, I worked at a neighborhood furniture store. I greeted customers, stocked shelves, and swept the floors after closing. In the evenings, I took design classes and accepted every small project I could find. A retired couple wanted help redesigning their reading room. A young family needed their nursery painted on a tight budget. A local cafe asked if I could make the space feel warmer without spending much money. I said yes to everything, not because the jobs paid well, because each one taught me something. There were nights when I fell asleep with paint on my hands and sketches scattered across my bed. I was exhausted. But for the first time, I was tired because I was building something, not because I was trying to prove I deserved to exist. One rainy afternoon, an elderly customer wandered into the furniture store carrying a notebook filled with rough floor plans. His name was Harold Bennett. He owned several historic buildings that he wanted to restore instead of demolish. Most designers had laughed at his modest budget. I didn't. I spent an hour listening while he explained why old buildings deserved a second chance. Before leaving, he looked at me and smiled. "You don't just hear what people say," he said. "You hear what they mean." A week later, he called and offered me my first real design project. It wasn't glamorous. It was an aging bookstore with creaky floors, faded walls, and shelves that looked ready to collapse. I poured my heart into every detail. When the renovation was finished, customers stayed longer. Sales increased. People said the store felt peaceful, as if it had finally remembered who it was. Soon another business owner called. Then another. Without realizing it, my weekends disappeared under blueprints, paint samples, and client meetings. Years passed quietly. Not in dramatic leaps. In small victories. One satisfied customer became 3. 3 became 10. Eventually, I opened a small design studio. I named it Blue Note Design, after my grandmother's little music box. The same music box still sat on my desk. Whenever I doubted myself, I'd wind it once. Its gentle melody reminded me that something fragile could still endure. Around that time, I met Daniel. We bumped into each other at a charity event where I'd volunteered to redesign a community center. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply noticed that I'd skipped dinner and quietly handed me a plate before introducing himself. Daniel was an architect. He believed beautiful spaces should help people feel safe, not just look expensive. It was the first conversation I'd ever had where someone asked about my dreams and actually waited for the answer. Months later, we married in a small garden surrounded by close friends, coworkers, and the people who had become my chosen family. There were no grand speeches. No luxury ballroom. No headlines. Just laughter, simple promises, and the feeling that I had finally found a place where love wasn't something I had to earn. I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. Then, nearly 9 years after I'd walked out of my parents' house, an ivory envelope appeared in my mailbox. The return address stopped me cold. It was from my family. And inside was an invitation that would bring me face to face with the people who had once convinced me I would never be enough. I stared at the invitation for nearly an hour before opening it again. It was Ethan's wedding. Elegant stationery. Gold lettering. Every detail carefully planned. At the bottom, in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 simple words. It would mean a lot if you came. No apology. No explanation. Just a sentence that felt strangely unfamiliar coming from her. Daniel found me sitting at the kitchen table with the invitation in one hand and my grandmother's blue music box in the other. "You don't have to go," he said gently. "I know. But if you do, go for yourself. Not for the version of them you're still hoping will exist." His words stayed with me. A month later, I slipped into a navy blue dress, tucked the little music box into my handbag, and drove to the country estate where the wedding was being held. The place was breathtaking. Stone pathways, white roses. A string quartet played softly while guests admired the gardens. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Then my mother saw me. Her smile disappeared almost instantly. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," she said. "It was an invitation," I replied calmly. "So I came." She glanced at my dress, then at the modest gift in my hands. "Well, try not to make today about yourself." I almost smiled. Some things, it seemed, never changed. Inside the reception hall, familiar faces looked at me with polite confusion. A few distant relatives whispered, trying to remember who I was. Others assumed I was one of Daniel's colleagues. No one asked where I'd been all those years. No one seemed curious. I found a quiet seat near the back of the room and watched Ethan greet his guests. He noticed me eventually. For a second, I thought he might walk over. Instead, he gave a brief nod before turning back to a conversation with a group of doctors. It didn't hurt the way it once would have. Time had a way of softening old wounds, not by erasing them, but by teaching you not to live inside them. As dinner began, the master of ceremonies announced a special guest who would offer a few words before the couple's first dance. I expected an old family friend. Instead, a distinguished woman stepped onto the stage. She was introduced as Margaret Lawson, chairwoman of one of the city's largest community redevelopment foundations. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Everyone seemed to know who she was. I knew her too. 3 years earlier, her foundation had partnered with Blue Note Design to restore several neglected neighborhood libraries and family shelters. Working with her had become one of the greatest honors of my career. She smiled warmly as she looked across the audience. "I'd like to thank Ethan and his wonderful family for inviting me tonight," she began. Then her eyes found mine. Her face lit up with genuine surprise. "Oh, Naomi? I had no idea you were family." Before I could react, she stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward my table. The entire ballroom turned to watch. I still didn't understand why everyone suddenly seemed so interested. Then Margaret reached me, wrapped me in a warm embrace, and said something that made the room fall completely silent. "You never told us your family was the woman who transformed so many lives." For a heartbeat, the ballroom was silent. I could almost hear the soft ticking of the antique clock above the fireplace. Margaret still had one hand resting on my shoulder. She smiled at the bride and groom before turning back to the guests. "I'm sorry," she said with a light laugh. "I just wasn't expecting to see Naomi here." My mother blinked in confusion. "You know our daughter?" Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "Know her?" She smiled at me again. "Naomi has been one of the most important partners our foundation has ever worked with." A quiet murmur spread across the room. I wished everyone would simply sit back down. Attention had never been comfortable for me. But Margaret continued. "When our board wanted to renovate abandoned libraries, veteran centers, and family shelters, every proposal focused on appearances." She paused. "Naomi asked us a different question." She looked around the ballroom. "How do we make people feel safe the moment they walk through the door?" Several guests nodded. That single question changed every project we've completed since. My father slowly lowered his glass. His expression wasn't pride. It was disbelief. Margaret wasn't finished. Her firm has helped restore more than 40 community spaces across the state. Children now have welcoming reading rooms. Families escaping difficult situations have places that finally feel like home. And she accomplished all of it without ever asking for recognition. I felt every eye in the room settle on me. Daniel quietly reached for my hand beneath the table. It steadied me. Then another man stood from a nearby table. I recognized him immediately. Harold Bennett, the elderly businessman who had trusted an inexperienced young designer with an old bookstore years ago. He smiled warmly. "I suppose I should admit something." The guests laughed softly. "I took a chance on Naomi because she was the first person who cared more about people than profit." He pointed toward me. "Every successful business I've restored since then carries a little piece of her vision." Someone nearby whispered, "She owns Blue Note Design?" Another guest answered, "The award-winning company?" My mother looked at me as though she were seeing a stranger. "You own Blue Note?" I simply nodded. There was nothing else to say. No speech. No explanation. The truth didn't need my help anymore. As the evening continued, people approached our table one after another. A school principal thanked me for redesigning their children's reading center. A veteran quietly shook my hand and told me the community hall we restored had become the first place he'd felt comfortable in years. A young couple introduced their daughter, explaining that they'd met while volunteering at one of the spaces our foundation had renovated. None of them knew anything about my family. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were simply sharing what those places had meant to them. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being valued for a title, a surname, or someone else's expectations. I was being appreciated for the work I'd quietly poured my heart into. Across the room, I caught my mother's eyes. There were tears there. Not dramatic tears. Just the quiet realization that she had spent years searching for success while overlooking the person who had been building something meaningful all along. The reception ended with applause for the newlyweds. As guests began leaving, my parents walked toward me together. Neither of them spoke right away. For once, they seemed to have run out of words. My parents stopped a few feet away from me. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The ballroom that had been so full of conversation only minutes earlier was now almost empty. Staff members cleared tables, the musicians packed away their instruments, and the sound of quiet laughter drifted in from the courtyard. My mother looked older than I remembered. Not weaker. Just tired. She folded her hands together. "Naomi," she said softly, "would you come home for dinner sometime?" It was such an ordinary question. Years ago, I would have heard it as a miracle. Now, I heard something else. An invitation that had arrived only after strangers had shown them my worth. My father cleared his throat. "We didn't know." I smiled gently. "I know." "No," he continued, his voice unsteady. "We truly didn't know who you'd become." I looked at him for a moment before answering. "I became who I was always trying to be." Neither of them replied. There wasn't really anything left to argue about. My mother reached toward me, then hesitated. "I think we made a lot of mistakes." I nodded. "We did." The word "we" surprised her. I wasn't taking the blame. I was acknowledging that families shape one another, for better or worse. She took a slow breath. "Can we start over?" I thought about the little girl who had waited by the window after school, hoping someone would ask how her day had been. I thought about my graduation ceremony. The unanswered note on the kitchen counter. The birthdays forgotten. The years of silence. Then I thought about Daniel waiting patiently by the entrance, smiling the same calm smile that had made me feel safe from the day we met. I realized something. Forgiveness and returning are not the same thing. "I don't carry anger anymore," I said quietly. "I forgave you a long time ago because I didn't want bitterness to become my home." Both of them looked relieved. Then I continued. "But I've already built a home." I glanced toward Daniel. "My family is waiting for me." There were tears in my mother's eyes now. Real tears. Not because I'd embarrassed her. Because she finally understood what she had lost. I stepped forward and hugged her. Then I hugged my father. The embrace was gentle, kind, and short. When I walked away, no one stopped me. Daniel opened the car door and, before getting in, I looked up at the stars. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was leaving my family. I felt like I was protecting the life I had worked so hard to build. That night, after we got home, I placed my grandmother's blue music box on the living room shelf. As I wound the tiny key, the familiar melody filled the room. Inside the lid was a small handwritten note I'd somehow never noticed before. The ink had faded with time, but I could still read every word. "The right people will never ask you to earn the love they freely give." I sat there quietly, letting the music play until it slowed to a stop. My grandmother had understood something decades before I did. Love isn't a prize for perfect children. It isn't reserved for the smartest, the richest, or the most successful. Real love is given without conditions. And if someone only discovers your value after the rest of the world applauds you, they didn't suddenly find your worth. They finally lost the ability to ignore it. My name is Naomi Carter. For years, I believed I had been the family's greatest mistake. Now I know the truth. I was never too little. I was simply planted in soil that couldn't appreciate what I was becoming. The moment I found healthier ground, I grew into the person I had always been meant to be. If there's one lesson my story has taught me, it's this. Love should never have to be earned. The people who truly love you will see your value long before the world does. Thanks for listening. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more original emotional family drama stories.